Hi everyone, welcome to the joy of botany, especially plant physiology. Let me introduce myself. I'm Kiran. I'm a 5-year integrated BSMS student of ISO Thiruvananthapuram. I found this is a great opportunity to talk to you about some concepts in the plant physiology. Thanks to you guys for that. Without further ado, let's begin. Today, I will be delivering a lecture about microelements that is required by plants. In this particular lecture, I will be talking about different microelements, how they are absorbed by the plants, that is their source, and their functions. And I also will be discussing about their deficiency symptoms. Now, plants actually acquire most of the microelements from nature. Naturally, there are different pathways through which they are absorbed, which mainly includes the membrane. The membrane normally there are specific receptors, and these receptors will allow particular elements. Like potassium ions may follow uniport and directly get into the membrane. And sometimes it happens that the proton channels along with protons that the H plus ions, nitrate ions can be absorbed. But they are mostly outside the cell and they get into the cell through the membrane bound receptors. There are also natural openings. These openings like stomata all helping in the entry of carbon dioxide. So in this way carbon intake can occur. But most of the cases the elements are absorbed in the soluble form. They are solubilized in water and they are absorbed via root hair. Then they get into the cortex. Ultimately they come into the xylem tissue and directly taken up by the plants and to their leaves where the photosynthesis takes place. Considering another important aspect, there is active transport. So there are specific ATP bound receptors which will help in the transport of these ions when the outside concentration is less, which means the outside concentration of that ion is less. But even then ATP will be utilized or hydrolyzed and they will be giving the regular supply of ion into the cell. So there are specialized receptors or specialized channels through which the ions are absorbed. Different types of microelements. There are different types of microelements. The important question is why they are called microelements. They are called microelements because they are required in bulk amounts and they mainly having different functions in different biological processes in the plant body and they include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium and sulfur. Now I will be talking about all these elements, their source and their deficiency symptoms. Carbon. We will start with carbon. Actually, carbon is the most important constituent because it is present entirely in the plant cell, cell organelles, also in the stored food, and carbon is fixed during photosynthesis in the form of carbon dioxide. And the basic plant food or carbohydrate is produced. And we know that animals also derive these carbohydrates from plants. There is a process known as non-cyclic photophosphorylation where there will be a specific H plus ion gradient will be created and this H plus ion will help in the operation of a particular ATP synthesis machinery which will allow the process of photosynthesis in a plant cell. Hydrogen. Hydrogen actually required by the plant wherever there is carbon. So hydrocarbon is a basic necessity and they constitute the cell wall, cell membrane, cell organelle and hydrogen is also present in water and water is so important for life. Oxygen. Oxygen is another useful mineral and it should not be called as a mineral because it's a gas. It's a vital gas required by plants and animals and as such in aerobic respiration. What happens is the oxygen acts as a terminal acceptor of electron which produces water and this water is required by plant life. So we see that carbon, hydrogen and oxygen are the basic elements and when we try to find out their uses we are at a loss because they are used virtually in every process within the plant body like in animals. Next is nitrogen. Basically, the nitrogen is mostly absorbed from the soil and actually with the help of different microbes. There are microbes which are nitrogen fixing organisms. And these organisms produce nitrate which is in turn taken up by the plant and utilized to produce amino acids. These amino acids will ultimately give rise to proteins Now we can understand that this nitrogen is required for different purposes. Example, nitrogen is useful in protein synthesis and nitrogen is also useful in making the building blocks. It also acts as a useful source which is the production of chlorophyll, and this chlorophyll is associated with photosynthesis. Along with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen and magnesium, nitrogen is there in chlorophyll. So, if there is no nitrogen, what will happen? Initially, there are different deficiency symptoms. But unlike carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, nitrogen will show definite symptoms like discoloration of leaf, and this is called chlorosis. Chlorosis at the early stages will be very less in the case of nitrogen deficiency. But in the later stages, the entire leaves turns yellow. So, nitrogen is very much important. Nitrogen, as you know, is useful in producing amino groups which can actually bind to the different keto acids. And keto acids in the TCA cycle produce different essential amino acids by transamination and deamination. And accordingly, there are useful amino acids produced like proline, glutamine, asparagine, etc. So, what we are saying is without nitrogen, there will be stunted growth and there will be chlorosis and there won't be any plant life. Phosphorus. Coming to the next macro element, which is phosphorus. Essentially, the phosphorus is also absorbed from the water in the form of phosphate or other salts. And this phosphorus absorption in plant body mainly helped by certain fungi. They are called the mycorrhizal fungi. What they do is they colonize on the root surface and they help in the uptake of phosphate into the plant body, and inside the plant they may be used in different purposes. The most important of them being the production of nucleic acids, that is the DNA and RNA, because the backbone is formed by the phosphodiester linkage, which is actually useful in producing the genetic material. Apart from that, phosphorus is also required for the production of phospholipid, which is an important constituent of cell membrane. This phospholipid is having a particular head which is glycerophosphate, and along with which two fatty acids are there. So obviously we could understand that a particular cell membrane requires phosphorus, hydrogen, carbon and oxygen. Phosphorus is equally important, and this is important in the production of energy currency compound which is ATP. At any point of time, the metabolic energy comes from ATP and it is hydrolyzed to produce ADP and inorganic phosphate. And this particular phosphate is important in carrying out cell division. There are specific cyclin or cyclin-like proteins that are phosphorylated, and this phosphorylated cyclin brought about by cyclin-dependent kinase which help in the progression of the cell cycle. And thereby the plant growth actually taking place with the help of phosphorus. And if phosphorus deficiency is there, of course there will be discoloration of leaves, but most interestingly there will be accumulation of anthocyanin, which is a purple color pigment. Potassium. Potassium absorption mostly occurs from the soil in the form of solubilized potassium salts, and potassium absorption sometimes correlated with sodium absorption because of the sodium potassium antiport mechanism. But when potassium enters into the cell, it has different purposes like protein synthesis, cell elongation, phloem transport, enzyme activation, photosynthesis, and also in the elevation of different stress factors. So there are different functions of potassium. And potassium deficiency can also be understood by looking at the leaves, where there will be yellowing and brown lesions on the leaf surface. Next, we have come to sulfur. It is also a very important element absorbed from the soil in the form of sulfate salt soluble in water. Once the sulfur is inside the cell, it produces different sulfur containing amino acids like methionine, cysteine, cysteine, etc. And methionine, you know, the most important amino acid because it is initiating the translation process, and it is also present in different vitamins. Of course, plants do produce vitamins. Sulfur is an important constituent of vitamin B1 and vitamin B7 or biotin, which is also obtained from these plants by animals. Apart from that, sulfur is important in the production of sulfur lipids, which is a stress-related compound and present in the electron transport machinery, that is ferredoxin. Sulfur deficiency also causes chlorosis, but in this case, which is very interesting, it is between two veins. So if a particular plant is showing sulfur deficiency, there will be continuous yellow stripes on the leaf surface. Now we have come to a very interesting element, that is calcium. Calcium is also obtained from the soil as calcium salts, which is soluble in water. And once the calcium is inside, it will produce important layer of the cell wall, which is called the middle lamella. Middle lamella is the cementing layer. It is producing calcium pectate, and there it is producing the primary wall and the secondary wall. So basically, if calcium is not there, there will be flaccidity of the plant cell and growth will be hampered, or definitely there will be stunted growth. There will be some important symptoms we see in tomato. There will be blossom and rot, and calcium as such is also required by those plants which are required more lime or alkaline soil like nicotine. There will be more calcium requirement. Calcium deficiency can be seen in leaves as curling leaf tip disease of different plants. Also, as you see in the tomato fruit, there will be rot at the end of the fruit, which is called the blossom end rot. Magnesium. As you know, magnesium is the most important constituent of chlorophyll. So, magnesium deficiency is actually seen in the form of chlorosis. But at the same time, magnesium is also having other important functions, which includes uptake and transformation of phosphorus, production of different fatty acids, different enzymes involved in carbohydrate metabolism, and also transformation of sugar-like compounds in the plants. So definitely magnesium is a very useful element. But another interesting point is that magnesium is required for chlorophyll synthesis. At the same time, fungi, which is a non-chlorophyllous organism, also require magnesium because magnesium will help in the binding of the ribosomal units and that will help them in protein synthesis. So thereby we understand that magnesium plays a very useful role in protein synthesis apart from chlorophyll synthesis. And when I talk about chlorophyll, I must tell you that magnesium is the central molecule or central element which is holding porphyrin ring. This particular structure of chlorophyll cannot be formed without magnesium. So, magnesium deficiency definitely will show chlorosis, and the chlorosis will primarily begin from the end and it will come towards the center. So, when we look back, we found that macroelements are not only metals, they are maybe non-metals and metals associated together, and as such we can consider it as carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. These three are the basic elements. These basic elements can be absorbed mostly from the nature and they can be absorbed through different natural openings like stomata and lenticels. And carbon, hydrogen, oxygen constitute the majority of the components in the plant body. They are producing the cell wall, cell membrane, also producing water, which is so important for plant life. And at the same time, they are also useful in electron transport system. Particularly, there is the proton channel which helping in the formation of H plus ions on one side, as a result of which the ATP synthesis takes place with the activation of ATP synthetase enzyme, and this is basically a proton driven mechanism where we say a proton is deposited on one side of the membrane, as a result of which ATP synthesis takes place. So these are the most important elements required by all plants, and there has to be either in the form of carbon dioxide or in the form of natural fertilizers added into the soil. Coming to the next important three, which is the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, these three are applied to the soil and they are called NPK fertilizer. As such, nitrate is added to the soil and this nitrate is the source of nitrogen, and nitrogen produces amino acids and amino acids are 20 in number, which produces enormous number of proteins, and amino acids are also helping in the formation of enzymes which will carry out the metabolic processes. Phosphorus, as you see, is the most important constituent coming from the fertilizer, but this particular phosphorus is a constituent of nucleic acids, and when it is having additional phosphate, the ADP will produce ATP, which is the energy currency. So all the metabolic processes requires phosphorus, and without phosphorus there will be specific symptoms, which is stunted growth. And next one is sulfur. Basically sulfur as such may not be required directly, but sulfur is producing important amino acids and vitamins, which are very important growth regulators for a plant system. And if the vitamins B1 and B7 are not produced, sulfur deficiency is clearly observed in the form of stunted growth. Apart from that, we also have calcium and magnesium. These are two alkali metals, and these two alkali metals are absorbed from the soil and they are mostly taken up in the form of soluble salt. The calcium, whenever it is enriched in the soil, they are useful for different purposes. Like in animals, plants also requires a background support, and it is given by the cell wall. And the cell wall is produced by the calcium. Apart from that, there are important channels which is operating along with sodium, potassium, and this requires the help of calcium. Calcium actually creates a proton gradient or a cationic gradient, which is helping in the absorption of anion. So calcium absorption inside a plant system is mostly through the root system, and once the calcium is inside the root hair, it will come to the epidermis, cortex, and cortex then become active, and this activity of the cortex will then help in the operation of different calcium channels. And once the calcium is inside, gradually the cell wall become hard, and this calcium is transported to the plant tip, where the tips will grow and the meristematic tissue will be performing growth. So without calcium there will be definite signs of stunted growth, particularly the apical meristem will be drying down. The last one, which is magnesium, is also an alkaline earth metal, and this particular magnesium will help in the production of chlorophyll. Magnesium will help in the photosynthetic processes, and if the photosynthesis is not taking place, then there will be no sugar synthesis and there will be stunted growth. But the most important property of magnesium is it is helping in the formation of chlorophyll. So if the magnesium is not there, there will be chlorosis, and at the same time there will be less protein synthesis, so metabolic processes will be shorted. So thereby we can see these macroelements are only about 10 in number. It is playing an important role in the plant system, and they are involved in the production of the structural elements. At the same time, they are helping in the metabolic processes, and their deficiency will bring about specific symptoms. And sometimes the symptoms may be overlapping, but if we can see the plant closely, we can understand there is specific elements which are not available in adequate amounts in the soil. Accordingly, these elements can be added to the soil in the form of fertilizer, which will help in the form of plant growth and agricultural productivity, and thereby macroelements acquired from nature helps in plant growth. They bring about agricultural productivity. And without their presence, the plant growth will be totally shattered. Hence we require macroelements mainly for plant growth, for our food, and without them plants cannot grow. That's all for today's lecture. We will definitely continue with very interesting and exciting concepts in the topic plant physiology. I wish you a good day. Thank you.